Implementing reflection in your work practice can be really tricky, and that's why we use reflective tools like Kolb's model of reflection. In this video, I'm going to be talking about all things Kolb's model of reflection. We're going to look at understanding Kolb's model of reflection, unpacking it, and working out how do we exactly implement that into our practice to have better outcomes. I'm Catherine and I'm a social worker, and in my practice, I often use tools like Kolb's model to make sure I'm reflecting and applying appropriate practice to my clients and making sure that I'm working to their best outcomes. So before we jump in, I just want to highlight that there's a heap of stuff available on our website that you can go grab if there is anything additional you want in terms of information or resources in relation to reflection or Kolb's model. So on that note, we're going to jump in and we're going to start by just looking at what are the things that are important to know about Kolb's model. Well, David Kolb is the guy who kind of set it all up. He released a book in 1984 detailing his research into learning styles and how he believed that occurred through reflection. Now, he developed this model, and that's really what the focus is going to be on today. And the model describes how we learn through reflection. A lot of people refer to this as the experiential learning model, and nowadays we know that it is a reflective cycle that we can use to implement in practice. In my opinion, it is one of the easiest ones to actually get your head around and implement because it only involves 4 steps. Let's take a look. So this is Kolb's reflective cycle. Now, there are 4 distinct phases in Kolb's model that we're going to talk through in terms of what is involved and how do they work. But as a bit of an overview to start with, we have concrete experience, reflective observation, abstract conceptualization, and active experimentation. Now, we always will start with a concrete experience in Kolb's cycle. We want to start with something that we've seen or observed and something that's actually concrete for us. We've actually experienced that. Then afterwards, we're going to reflect on that experience, right? We're going to reflect on our observations and what's happened. Then we're going to encounter something called abstract conceptualization, where we really allow ourselves to enter our metacognitive state and use our brain to kind of conceptualize what would happen if we did something differently or if we approach something in a different way. Then finally, we would enter active experimentation phase, where we would implement the things we thought about during the abstract conceptualization phase and actually implement those in practice. Now, when we do that, we then have a new concrete experience to base our future reflections on. So in Kolb's model, it really is about going through this cycle around and around and around to work out how do we best interact with our environment or best interact with our clients or students, depending on what practice discipline you're working within. So Kolb differentiated each of the 4 stages based on different cognitive processes that he proposed needed to occur independently of each other. Now, when we start with the concrete experience phase, he felt that this was really about our feeling state. So what were we feeling during the concrete experience? What were some of the emotions that came up? What were some of the different pulls and cravings we had? Following that, when we look at our reflective observation phase, we then integrate the things that we observed. So the things that we saw happening, so what we watched. So the cognitive process he associates with reflective observation is watching. And he often argues that we will merge these 2 together. So we'll think about what we were feeling and combine that with the observations we had or the watching events. And so those 2 together create our reflection of what actually happened. But during the concrete experience phase, we're engaging in our feelings. And then when we get to reflective observation, we're actually reflecting on what we observed. So noting that these 2 things are believed to happen independently. Now, I understand that in practice, we often will have a concrete experience followed by a couple of seconds of thinking through how that happened. But you notice that when you're having the experience, you're not necessarily reflecting in that moment on what actually happened. So in Kolb's model, it really is about differentiating those 2 things. And there are other models that say things different to this. This is just Kolb's model. So then after we've done it, been through the concrete experience phase and the reflective observation phase, we move into our 3rd phase, which is that abstract conceptualization. And we start to bring in some of our thinking processes. So that's where our thoughts and thinking comes in terms of the cognitive processing at this level. Noting that we really can't have feeling and thinking occurring at the same time in a way that's going to be really helpful to the situation. We need to be mindful that our feelings really are a biological response first and a emotional response second. And so when we have feelings that are clouding our thinking, we're often not going to have the best approach forward. So in order by doing feeling first, reflective observation, and then moving into thinking, we can almost desensitize ourselves a little bit to any of those big emotions that may have clouded our judgment in the concrete experience. And when we get to the abstract conceptualization phase and we're required to think about it, we might have a better approach to the situation and understanding exactly what happened in an objective manner. Now, when we're doing abstract conceptualization, it really is about that abstract thought and abstract thinking. You're really encouraged in this phase to think about what went well, what didn't go well, what are the things that you would try in the future. And this is where we can start looking at future planning and future processing and work out how do we best move forward. After we've identified how we can best move forward, that's when we move into our final phase, which is active experimentation. And this is all about doing. So for Kolb, he believes that after we can think, we can then do. So we want to experiment with those things that we just brainstormed in our abstract conceptualization phase by putting some of those things into practice. We may have thought of a new way to explain something to someone, or we may have thought of a new tool to use with a particular client. We may have come up with a new idea for a lesson. And so all of those things will then be put into practice in the active experimentation phase. And you'll notice that after we enter the active experimentation phase, we then have a new concrete experience to base on. So, in really simple terms, when we're thinking about the cognitive processes and how do we actually put these into practice, these are going to be your cognitive verbs that you can use to go, okay, how am I going through Kolb's model? We want to first do feeling, then we want to be watching or observing, and then we want to be thinking, and then we want to be doing. So, a very simple reflective model, but incredibly important and powerful when used appropriately in practice. So, there you have it. That's Kolb's model of reflection. You are prepared now to implement that model into practice now that you understand how it works and the different moving parts. But if you feel like you still want a little bit of extra information, feel free to head over to our website where we have a free worksheet that talks through all the different steps of Kolb's model of reflection following a concrete experience. Now, you might find that after you use that worksheet a couple of times, the steps are already quite prevalent in your head and you actually don't need it anymore. And that's okay. We want to aim to a point where we can conduct our own reflection and following an experience pretty independently of anything written down. Because there's going to be occasions where you can't necessarily just take a moment to actually write down your reflections all the time. When you're working in practice, I really encourage you to use a model of reflection like Kolb's, but I'd be really interested to know if you've used this before or if there's another reflective tool that you use that is really successful for you in practice. So let me know in the comments below. That's all from me, but as always, if you want any particular resources, tools, topics discussed, do let us know. And otherwise, I'll see you in our next video.